Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, it's my pleasure to open the post-summer season of events at FIIA. I know that August is a little bit difficult month still for many, but the topics are crucial, critical and important, so we decided to jump-start a bit and host the session this afternoon with excellent set of panelists on Nordic perspectives to NATO. As you very well know, the first reaction, the gut instinct in Finland when we filed the NATO application together with Sweden was to emphasize the Nordic. It came very easily for us. It was instinctive that the future role of Finland should have a strong characteristic, Nordic characteristic. So the scenarios that we were building and are still building are very much based on the Nordic direction. There were sayings invented like fortification of the North, Nordic bastion, and all of those refer to Finland trying to comprehend against the background of its own strategic culture, the historical experience, what does it mean to be allied in alliance? What should be the kind of the emphasis areas? But of course, as the time goes on, there has been a realization that it's a whole package of different things. So the question then becomes, against that whole package of different things, how to recontextualize the importance of the Nordic dimension. There's nothing in Finland that stops the emphasis of the Nordic. If you ask from the Finnish population anything that deals with the Nordic or Sweden, the opinion polls, the favorability is going to be about 90%. So that's the gut feeling, the instinct of the nation, and that's going to direct the process, but there are other things to consider as well, as we have understood. One thing that I wanted to perhaps leave to the panelists to think about is the strategy of compartmentalization that is very common in international relations. You segment different policy areas, and now in terms of the war of aggression against Ukraine that Russia started, our neighbor started in the neighborhood. Of course, the question then becomes, what are the ramifications when it comes to trying to compartmentalize the issue? So how existential or functional should be the response? There has been discussion in Finland about the visa issue, for example, clearly showing that compartmentalization is to a degree failing. Certain issues that were thought to be part of the normal interaction between Finland and Russia are no longer outside of the effects and the impact of war. So what degree? That's the key question in here. In what ways the war is going to impact Finnish-Russian relations, how that is going to impact the multilateral fora where Russia is present or no longer present, like in the Arctic Council, which is frozen, how long that can be kept frozen. And is it functional to keep multilateralism frozen in the freezer, so to say? Or should we proceed in absence of Russia? There's multiple examples of that, and those are the key questions. And that is also relevant for today's discussion when it comes to Nordics doing deeper interactions together, deeper integration together, all the way to the defense policies and being allied. So what does that mean? Not as an identity question, but as a practical question. What do those scenarios implicate? What type of characteristics they have, and how they are going to then translate into Finnish-Russian policies, how they are going to translate to the Arctic policies and how they are going to translate into the overall Baltic Sea scenario, and also to a key, very sensitive issue in the Finnish foreign policy discussions, the security of the Gulf of Finland. But with those words, I would like to welcome all the panelists today and the audience, and Matti, Pesu will take the lead. Matti is leading researcher in our program on Finnish foreign policy, regional security and NATO. That is something that we are going to announce next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mika, and good afternoon on my behalf as well. As Mika said, I'm Matti Pesu, leading researcher at FIIA, and I have the great pleasure to share this seminar and panel discussion addressing Finland's and Sweden's NATO membership from Nordic perspectives. This event is part of FIIA's in-house research project led by yours truly called Finland's Evolving Role in Euro-Atlantic Security. And the project analyzes Finland's NATO membership process and the nascent NATO policy of Finland. Additionally, it explores the effects of Russia's February 2022 invasion of Ukraine on Northern European security. And then the third aim of the project is to follow how the US-Europe policy develops in the near and also in longer term. Today's theme, Nordic perspectives on Finland's and Sweden's NATO accession, is highly topical. On Monday this week, the prime ministers of the 5 Nordic countries met in Oslo, and they released a joint statement which, for example, proclaimed that, quote, Nordic defense cooperation will be adjusted to the new security order through joint training, integrated planning, and the ability to conduct operations seamlessly. The effectiveness of our defense can be greatly enhanced, unquote. So one can argue that from a historical perspective, the security environment and its underlying drivers have never been this permissive for deeper Nordic security and defense cooperation. Soon, the 5 Nordic countries will be members of the same alliance, and their threat perceptions are more or less aligned. And as Mika said, everything Nordic enjoys solid support from the public across all the 5 Nordic countries. Today we're excited to host 3 excellent speakers, and I'll introduce them briefly. Kristian Fischer, he's the director of the Danish Institute for International Studies, DIIS, and before his position at the Institute, he served in multiple governmental capacities, for example, at the Danish delegation to NATO and the Danish Defense Ministry as a Deputy Permanent Secretary. Our second panelist is Dr. Iro Särkkä. She's currently employed as senior advisor at the University of Helsinki and has previously worked as a researcher and special advisor at the Finnish Defense Forces. And presently she is also very actively engaged in the public debate on Finland's NATO membership and NATO more broadly. Our third speaker today is Eva Hagström Frisell from the Swedish Defense Research Agency, FOI, where she works as the Deputy Research Director heading FOI's program on Northern European and transatlantic security. We've asked the panelists to deliver short, roughly 10-15 minute remarks, and after their presentations I will open the floor for questions. And I suggest that we follow the order laid out in the program. So if I may ask Director Fischer to start. So Mr. Fischer, take it away.
Certainly will. Thank you very much, Matti, for the invitation. If you can't hear me in the back or somewhere else, please wave with your hand. Yeah, now it works. I can see. It's really good to be back here in Helsinki again and be part of this extremely timely seminar. I've been looking very much forward to this, even though I was here shortly before the summer holiday break. And of course, this is the case because the Russian invasion of Ukraine has really changed the security situation in Europe dramatically. And we know that not only NATO members but also EU member states now see Russia as a direct threat. And this is really remarkable. I've been in security affairs since the early 90s, and back in the 90s we even talked about whether Russia at some point in time could become a member of NATO. That nobody talking about that these years. It is also, of course, clear that the upcoming enlargement of NATO with Finland and Sweden will change security conditions substantially in the coming years. It really demands much more NATO attention to the region. And I sometimes question myself if Putin would have invaded Ukraine if he had known that Finland and Sweden would join NATO. I'm very much convinced that if the Putin regime had known that Finland and Sweden would join NATO, and that there would be terrible Russian losses in Ukraine, and that Russia would be very much dependent on China in the coming years, they would probably have thought even more about whether this was a good idea or not. I will focus my 10 plus minutes on 3 issues. First of all, I'll say a little bit about the Danish reactions to Finland and Sweden's decisions to join NATO. I'll say a bit after that about new possibilities for Nordic cooperation, and lastly I will try to identify some key issues where Sweden and Finland, each of them, will need to consider decisions, but also areas, of course, which entails decisions from the upcoming allies as well. But let me start with Denmark, and I can say with a lot of force that Denmark has been a strong supporter of closer cooperation between NATO and Sweden and Finland for a long time. It all started back, as I remember it, from when the Partnership for Peace initiative was launched back in 1994, and Denmark very much encouraged closer ties with NATO in the following decades. Not only encouraged it, but also worked hard for it. But we have always in Denmark been very careful not to recommend what Finland and Sweden should do when it came to membership. We are very much aware that this is a decision that is for Sweden and Finland to decide on. And therefore, the reactions from the Danish public, but also at the political level to the Finnish and Swedish decisions to apply for membership, have been overwhelmingly positive, I can say. The vast majority in Denmark warmly welcomes both Finland and Sweden upcoming membership of NATO, and I can dare to say that ratification will be no problem at all in Denmark. There's a huge respect for Finland and Sweden in Denmark. Being here in Finland, I can say to you, I've seen many newspaper articles about the strength of the Finnish armed forces, the defense culture in Finland, just to take an example there. And we all know that we have societies which are based on democratic values and so forth. So there's no question mark on whether Finland and Sweden would fit into to NATO. The only bit of noise I can say that there has been in Denmark on this was a little bit on the left, where some members of parliament said, well, would this really be good for regional stability in the region? But nobody, not even those parliamentarians, said that this was not a decision for Finland and Sweden to make themselves. So the vast majority of Danes see membership of NATO by Finland and NATO as very positive, and also positive for Danish security, and for many Danes also for the Baltic states' security, for obvious reason. I can go into more details about that. So that combined with the strong political signal it sends to Russia, that if you don't treat your neighbors well, if you don't respect them, then they will feel insecure and more or less forced to take choices which may not be of Russia's liking. So that is, I will not say things are on autopilot, but I don't see any drama in the Danish ratification process at all. And part of that is, of course, also because many people in Denmark see that all the Nordics being, for the first time ever, in the same security alliance presents some very, very important new dimensions for cooperation. As Mika said, Nordic cooperation is popular in Finland, but it is also very popular in Denmark, I can say. And this is the first time that we have not only these 5 Nordic states in the same security alliance, NATO, but as many of you would know, Denmark has also lifted its defense reservation on the EU, so we are now fully member of the EU also on the defense dimension there. Then we have, of course, Norway, who has chosen to be outside the EU, but there's been really an alignment of security matters in the Nordic group, and that presents some special opportunities. And one of the reasons for this, I think, is that we do, in fact, share common values, and we also have a lot of common interest. If I should mention some of those common values and common interests, we all have a task to work together against democratic backsliding in the EU and in NATO. We have areas where we are very much on the offensive on the international arena: human rights, equality of sexes, effective resource management, climate action, and so forth. We are nations who are very much aware of the inequalities in the world and work on that. So I think that there is really a strong foundation for cooperation within the Nordic group and present itself not only in NATO but also within the EU. We also, all of our nations, attach very strong interest to the transatlantic ties. That is not always easy, but that is important. It may be even more important after the next US election. So I think that there's a lot of possibilities within NATO and the EU for increased Nordic cooperation. But I still think also that Nordic cooperation, namely in NORDEFCO, still has a relevance of its own. It's clear that certain parts of NORDEFCO work can be lifted into NATO structures. Some of the cooperation and consultations regarding operations, some armaments cooperation, some of the logistics cooperation can be lifted into NATO. But there are still things that need to be done within a NORDEFCO framework. And clearly, we also need to see an even closer political and military consultations in NORDEFCO on Russia and how to handle Russia in our region. I think that we very much need a more comprehensive picture of developments in the Baltic Sea region. And of course, also within the NORDEFCO framework, there is the possibility of closer cooperation in preparation of NATO and of EU meetings. And finally, some points on the preparations for NATOship and some of the key issues that needs to be addressed. The first and very important one is NATO's command structure. And command structure, the NATO command structure, is really what makes NATO truly unique. This ability to be able to lead a very, very large military force with different services and being multinational in an effective way, that is what differentiates NATO from many other international organizations. There's no other organization which has that ability, and therefore it is the backbone of NATO. And of course, we need to have Finland and Sweden to plug into that command structure. And my assessment would be that there is a need for a Baltic Sea region command headquarter in NATO to cover not only the Baltic and the Nordic countries, but certainly also Poland and Germany. And of course, with substantial participation from our American allies and of course also from Germany and UK and France. And why do I say that? I say that because the Baltic Sea region really has become one of the key regions for the alliance after the invasion of Ukraine. So there is a need for a new command structure design. Some work is underway. As far as I understand, it's not all that advanced yet in NATO. But let me try to point to some of the difficult questions I will see. One of the obvious ones is the location of a NATO headquarter in the Baltic Sea region, and that is not only a military decision. The location of a headquarter also sends political signals, both within NATO but also to the outside, read Russia. If we look at the decisions at the NATO summit, the 3 Baltic nations and Poland will upgrade their multinational battle group headquarters to become brigade headquarters, and we already have a multinational division headquarter in Latvia and of course a NATO command structure in Poland. So I don't think that it is going to be so likely that there's going to be a NATO headquarter for the region in those 4 countries. And then you may ask, is it feasible to have a new NATO headquarter in Finland, very close to Russia, very close to St. Petersburg? That leaves, if that is not the case, that leaves Sweden, Denmark or Norway as a possible location for such a headquarter. When you think about these matters, I can say from early experience that you have to think carefully about what it costs to be a host nation for a headquarter. That price has increased over the last decades quite a bit, I can tell you. Secondly, it is a very important question, who should be the head of a new NATO command structure headquarter in the region. There's a lot of political and military prestige involved in that. It's probably going to be a 3-star general or admiral. Should it be a US officer, if not German or UK, Nordic, Baltic? Should we see some sort of rotation on that post between nations or and the other posts in the top leadership of such a headquarter? These issues are complicated, and a lot of efforts are being used on those, and not only between the militaries, also at sometimes at the highest political levels. I would also mention, when we talk about the NATO command structure, that it is very important for new nations to get the right professional profiles of their staff into not only the command structure but also the NATO agencies, where there are quite a few of those. It's not easy to find the right people, but you need a good mix of military and civilian professional profiles. Then there's, of course, the issue of defense plan for the Baltic Sea regions. Some stuff exists already, but it also has to be adjusted to take into account Finland and Sweden. Then there are also some other issues, the nuclear issue and the issue of permanent stationing of foreign military forces. Should there be national reservations on those issues? These are things where nations need to think very, very careful. And lastly, I will mention a few words about national decision-making processes. It is sometimes necessary to make really quick political decisions in NATO. Article 5 and collective defense is, of course, the most prominent example of such decision-making processes. And therefore, all member states need to be able to do swift coordination between their ministries, which cannot always be taken for granted, I can say. And there also, of course, needs to be coordination, consultation, etc., in Parliament before such decisions can be taken. Of course, depending what your constitution says on these issues. I know from my experiences back in 2001 during the 9/11 crisis, where NATO activated its collective security guarantee the day after 9/11, that this is an area where you need to be very well prepared. I know that Finland and Sweden are having very effective bureaucracies, but it is probably an area where we also need to make sure that you check it again. In Denmark, there is a need to call a meeting in the Parliament's Foreign Policy Foreign Policy Committee, and if we're going to make use of force beyond self-defense, that we also need to have a decision in Parliament, and these things take time. The shortest time we've done it in is 24 hours, but that's also a long time in a crisis. So to be able to look at these decision-making processes and hold them up against different scenarios is very important. My take would be that you would have a NATO track, decision-making track, and you have some national decision-making, especially from the bigger states, if we're talking about a NATO scenario. And add to this that you also need to have very effective communication to your public in these kinds of situations. This is complicated, it takes time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Director Fischer, for your pertinent remarks. I think as NATO's founding member, Denmark will have a lot to offer when Finland and Sweden are plugging themselves into NATO structures, and I think advice about how to navigate in the organization will be highly appreciated. But without further ado, I will now hand over the floor to Dr. Särkkä, who will give a Finnish perspective on the issue.
Yes, thank you. First of all, it gives me a great pleasure to be here this afternoon, to be speaking in front of such a distinguished audience and with this panel as well. And just like to reflect before I actually start my speech on the spring and the events that took place. I mean, if somebody had asked me a year ago whether Finland would actually be joining NATO and we would be having discussion, I probably would have laughed, because the debate in Finland about NATO was kind of pushed aside for many years. And it really seemed like other security frameworks had taken over, namely bilateral and trilateral agreements that we had with Finland and Sweden and Norway, with the US. Also, I think there was a lot of wishful thinking in Finland as well, that the European defense could actually develop into kind of contangible defense in a sense that it would replace even the alliance. But here we are today. And we actually are joining NATO. So I have 3 points as well in my speech. First of all, I'd like to reflect a little bit on the fact that how Finland's and Sweden's affiliation or membership in NATO will affect the North Atlantic security at large. The second point I'd like to discuss is that how Finland and Sweden, namely Finland, I would say, since I'm representing the Finnish perspective here, will contribute to the collective defense. That obviously remains to be seen, but I think we have some really good analysis already out there, and I think it's kind of possible to also evaluate what that could be like. And thirdly, I'd like to kind of reflect on the potential of Nordic security and Nordic defense cooperation. Especially within NATO, not as a kind of separate project, but within NATO, and also maybe critically assess here that are there any constraints tied to Finland's and Sweden's NATO membership. So let's start, and my first point is basically that Finland's and Sweden's NATO membership will stabilize the wider Nordic region, and in particular the Baltic region. And now that both of the countries will join, we all know that the Baltic Sea will become virtually an inner sea within NATO. And this is, in my view, a stabilizing factor in the Nordic region, and that will contribute to the collective defense and deterrence in the region, and that will actually decrease the likelihood for a military escalation. So what does it mean in collective defense? All three things. Common defense planning, like Director Fischer just pointed out. Also, we will join the command structure, and then also exercises. So I truly see that there will be a contingency plan, for instance, for the three Nordic countries, Norway, Sweden and Finland. I don't know, but this is my guess, and the Baltic countries could potentially join in that as well. Also, like Director Fischer said, my guess is that there will be a common operational command from which operations will be directed from. And obviously there will be a lot of joint Nordic exercises within NATO, but also with other close NATO allies. And this actually leads to my second point, which is that Finland's and Sweden's NATO membership will not only have consequences for Nordic countries, but also for other NATO countries, whether they are large or small. And in particular, if we look at the bigger NATO countries, the UK and United States, I think we are likely to see basically enhanced cooperation with the United Kingdom. It can happen through NATO, it can happen through the JEF, Joint Expeditionary Force format. And that also gives the United Kingdom an opportunity to, practice deeper defense cooperation without doing it inside the EU. But for the United States, more enhanced European security and defense within NATO and not outside NATO will basically mean that the US will be able to transfer its assets somewhere else, in particularly Asia. So they will be happy with that. But I think most of all, we have to consider Finland and Sweden as security providers, not security seekers in the region. And actually this is one of the arguments being given why Finland didn't join NATO in the early 90s, for instance, because we didn't profile ourselves as security seekers, but as security providers. And therefore, it comes down also not only in practical terms, what we have to give, but to the collective Nordic identity. And that we like to identify ourselves with a similar group of nations, and with Sweden, obviously our closest ally and partner, and therefore it makes a lot of sense to join together at the same time. In practical terms, I believe that both countries will participate in Baltic countries and Iceland's air policing, for instance. And then also that we're going to see troops on ground or some kind of capabilities, if not troops, for the NATO's enhanced forward presence troops in Baltic countries. Also, there are likely to be other joint capabilities to be developed, for instance, cyber, improved situational awareness in the Baltic Sea region. And also, I think it's interesting to see what happens in the High North and how Finland and Sweden will contribute to that. But I think most of all, and I think this is going to be the kind of difficult part as well, especially for Finland, is to understand that we have to come in terms with the fact that collective defense and security is not only about defending your own backyard, but also defending the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the alliance as a whole. And I think this is what Turkey has been trying to point out also in the course of the past few months. And I come later back to this point. So I think we are likely to see an increased Nordic presence also in other geographical regions, as well as participation in NATO-led operations wherever there will be. And obviously that remains to be seen what they are, but it could be possible that Finland and Sweden will participate in NATO's maritime Operation Sea Guardian, for instance, at the moment. Obviously in the future there will be other new operations. So, my third point, what is the actual potential of Nordic security and defense cooperation? And I guess I'm here talking more now as a defense cooperation as such within NATO and not the NORDEFCO part, although I think NORDEFCO still continues to exist. Well, there are no limitations anymore. I mean, I think part of the fact why NORDEFCO didn't really develop into something more tangible was the fact that Finland and Sweden were not NATO members, and there was only a limit up to which information could be shared between the different countries. So on a practical level, there will be no such constraints anymore. Common planning can take place, and also sharing of information. But on a more critical tone, I think we should ask ourselves now that are there any other constraints still, even though when we join the alliance, that we will have to come in terms with? And are there any other constraints that we kind of need to readjust so that we can make this common Nordic security culture to prosper? And the first obvious constraint that I see is the operating environment. Even if the Nordic countries are located in geographical proximity to each other, they all look really into different directions geographically. So they all have different borders, for instance. Finland has a very long border with Russia, Sweden has a very long coastline, looking both directions, Baltic Sea and North Sea. And then when you look at Norway and Denmark, they have Arctic issues in mind. And I think this is one of the facts that we have to realize, that even though we have the will to do it together, we still have the geopolitical constraints, and then we have to learn to diversify. So rather than seeing these geopolitical borders and geographical borders as constraints, I think we should consider them as opportunity to diversify our military capability development. And this will basically mean that now we have a potential for a long-term strategic planning, where decisions could be ideally taken on the basis of pooling and sharing principle. And what I mean by this is not to do it separately from NATO, but within NATO, when Nordic countries, Finland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark and Iceland, could actually, with the support of other allies, namely the United States and the UK, make the northern and eastern flank of the alliance and the Arctic region as well, a military posture even stronger. The second constraint are the resources, obviously. Are all the Nordic countries in position and willing to spend in a long term? And I think this is one of the worries that there were also in the United States over the discussion that took place in the parliament there. Are they willing to spend the 2% of GDP in defense planning in long term, even if it's recommended by NATO? And are these constraints and assets, do they meet together? And is there basically any cost savings that we can then achieve? But my question is that, should we really fully think that are there any cost savings perspectives that should be reconciled? Or should we just be happy with one criterion, and that is increasing the operational effectiveness and leave the kind of cost logic behind? Like ideally, Nordic defense would save money, but I don't think this is a money-saving issue, or even lead to common procurement, but maybe this is not feasible either. But I still think that Nordic defense has value to add. So it comes to the fact, are we ready to pool and share military capabilities? And do we have the will, the political will and the common trust to be achieved not only within the Nordic cluster, but also towards the other NATO countries? Now, this might not be such a relevant question for Denmark and Norway, since you've been members since NATO's inception, and certainly not for Iceland, who so heavily relies on the US assets. But for Sweden, and especially for Finland, yes, whose military doctrine has been based on credible and independent national defense. So I'd like to conclude by saying that for a Nordic security culture and defense really to prosper, I think we need a mental shift in Finland, in our national security mindset, to trust really one another and other allies, and really fully comprehending this kind of ethos of collective defense, what it means, will take its time. But I think also it's a journey that we really have to start now for the sake of maximizing our national security, both in the wider Nordic and Euro-Atlantic region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Iro. That's an excellent overview of the potential and also potential constraints of Nordic cooperation in the NATO context, and it will be very interesting to see how Finland is a very, let's say, a nationally orientated country with the national strategic culture will adjust itself to a multinational defense alliance. But I think the strategic interests overlap quite neatly. But then I will now have the pleasure to yield the floor to Eva Hagström Frisell from FOI. Take it away, Eva.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation to come here on this stunning late summer day in Helsinki to address a very topical issue. And as you all know, for Sweden, Finland's NATO debate and decision-making process was very crucial for Sweden also taking the step to apply for NATO membership. And the perception in Sweden is clearly that Swedish and Finnish NATO membership will enhance Nordic defense cooperation. And I would like to talk a little bit about how Sweden and Finland's NATO membership will affect Nordic cooperation, looking back a little bit how it has developed over time and how it could evolve and also integrate more into a NATO context. And many points have already been touched upon, but when the Nordic defense cooperation was initiated more than 10 years ago, it was primarily motivated as a way to maintain capabilities in times of economic cutbacks. But since 2014 and Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea and the first intervention in Ukraine, it was rather driven by a deteriorating security situation and common operational concerns. And the Nordic countries, with the exception of Finland after full mobilization, have rather small armed forces and are dependent on support from the outside in case of a crisis or conflict in the Baltic Sea area. And that is why Nordic defense cooperation has already from the beginning worked within the framework of NATO and the transatlantic link. And since 2014, it has largely focused on intensified security policy dialogue and operational cooperation. Many initiatives and agreements were, however, limited to facilitate exchange of information in peacetime or exercises. But since the adoption of the NORDEFCO vision, new NORDEFCO vision in 2018, the stated aim has been to cover cooperation in peace, crisis, and conflict. But there are a number of preparations that are necessary both at the political and military level to act together in a crisis or conflict. And at the political level, the Nordic defense ministers and staffs have engaged in scenario-based discussions, established secure communication systems and a crisis consultation mechanism. And this has also been used now during Russia's war with Ukraine. And Sweden and Finland have also adopted legislation to enable more rapid decision-making on giving and receiving support to each other. And at the military level, the operational cooperation has largely been developed in bilateral or trilateral fora between the countries. And the closest partnership has been established in... Okay. Okay. At the military level, the operational cooperation has largely been developed bilaterally or trilaterally between the Nordic countries. And the closest partnership has been established between Sweden and Finland. And the cooperation has no formal predetermined limits, and a memorandum of understanding from 2018 included the ambition to develop common operational planning for different scenarios. And in 2020, a trilateral letter of intent was signed between Finland, Sweden and Norway with a focus on the northern part of the countries. And the ambition here was to coordinate national operational plans and even develop some common operational plans. And in 2021, the second trilateral cooperation between Denmark, Sweden and Norway was added with a focus then on the southern parts of Scandinavia, including the Baltic Sea, the Danish Straits, Kattegat, Skagerrak and the North Sea. But in addition to common or coordinated planning, there are a number of practical preparations that are necessary to be able to act together in a crisis or conflict. And this has, for example, been tested through regular Nordic participation in exercises in the region. And even here, the Swedish-Finnish cooperation has come the furthest and involves exchange of staff officers, the signing of a host nation support agreement, the setting up of common units within the navies, and regular contacts and exchanges between other units and regiments. And this really clarifies and develops relationships, promotes a common understanding of doctrine and procedures, and also importantly rules and regulation, which then can facilitate common action in a crisis or conflict. And many of these steps between Finland and Sweden could also be a model for closer cooperation with Norway and Denmark. But as already been mentioned, the limitation to all these collaborations were that they did not include any binding commitments, as Sweden and Finland wanted to maintain freedom of action in a crisis or war. And on the other hand, Denmark and Norway, in those trilateral agreements, stated that command and control would be transferred to NATO in a crisis or war. And the lack of binding commitments also caused limitations on the level of planning also in peacetime, because you could not rely on that planning in a crisis or war. And major added value of Nordic defense cooperation would previously most likely have been in a crisis before NATO as a whole got engaged. And another obstacle that was also already mentioned was that the Nordic countries to some extent had different views on the threat from Russia, how Russia should be handled, and geographical priorities. And Finland's exposed position with a long border with Russia has led to a robust defense structure and a focus on societal resilience compared to Denmark, considering that it's no longer a frontline state, more focusing on NATO deployments away from its own territory, and the reception and onward movement of NATO reinforcements rather than territorial defense. And Norway and Denmark has furthermore focused more maritime resources on the high north and North Atlantic, while Sweden and Finland have a larger interest in the Baltic Sea. And this made the capabilities available for cooperation, particularly in the southern Scandinavian agreement, limited. And with Sweden and Finland then becoming NATO members, many of these previous obstacles to Nordic defense cooperation will be removed. For example, the Swedish defense minister has now stated that the ambition is to develop common operational planning also with Denmark and Norway. Sweden and Finland joining NATO may also put increasing pressure on all the Nordic countries to engage in the development of regional defense plans within NATO. On the other hand, this has to be done in a NATO context, and the Nordic operational planning have to align with NATO defense planning, and there will be, as we've heard before, new demands to integrate Finland and Sweden into NATO's theater-wide operational plans, which includes the transformation of NATO's forward presence, for example, in the Baltic states. There will be changes to NATO's command structure and the setup of NATO's new force structure that was announced at the Madrid summit. And I think all these efforts will require resources and may actually split particularly Finland's and Sweden's focus from furthering developing these bilateral and trilateral Nordic defense cooperation. But I also believe that there are many reasons to continue Nordic defense cooperation, also with all the Nordic countries as members of NATO. It can be viewed as contributing to burden sharing with the alliance. It may constitute a first response in a crisis before the alliance as a whole gets engaged. And it may be perceived as less sensitive to Russia with regional cooperation rather than having a permanent basing of other alliance members and military installations in Sweden and Finland. And as Iro pointed out, having all the Nordic countries as NATO members may also enable new levels of cooperation when it comes to developing complementary capabilities and diversification or specialization. And I agree it will probably require a large change of mindset, particularly in Sweden and Finland, and how about organizing our defense efforts. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. It will certainly be interesting to see how then the bilateral and minilateral defense networks will develop in the NATO context. But now I'll open the floor for your questions and comments. I think I'll take 2 or 3 questions per time, and then well, I'll kindly ask you to be brief and succinct to leave room for as many views as possible. And please introduce yourself when taking the floor. But then I see two hands over there. Maybe first in the front, and then Atte Harjanne second. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, panel, for such an interesting discussion. My name is Mika.
Could you please open the mic? There should be a button there. Yes, great.
Okay, thank you so much. My name is Maria Puolakkainen. I work for a US-based conflict observatory, and I would like to address my question to all of you panelists. What, if any, concerns do you have regarding the tensions between national security and democratic processes, given that Finland and Sweden now prepare to join NATO, especially in reference to what Dr. Fischer mentioned about these swift national decision-making processes? Thank you.
Atte Harjanne.
Yeah, thank you. So Atte Harjanne, MP, Parliament of Finland. I think the war in Ukraine has been a kind of wake-up call for the importance of material readiness and capabilities, and pretty much all of Europe is scaling up their defense capabilities in terms of materials. And how do you see? Interested to hear, how do you see whether Nordics, now all in NATO or soon, are the natural kind of coalition for material cooperation more and more, or not? How would this develop, also taking into consideration the very or somewhat different roles and economic significance of defense industry in different Nordic countries? Thanks.
Thank you. And there was a question on my left-hand side.
This one. Hello, my name is Olga Kantakoski. I work at the Alexander Institute, University of Helsinki. I would like to address one of my questions to Ira and the rest to other panelists. First of all, Ira has said that Finland's NATO membership is a stabilizing factor, and it is kind of accepted as a fait accompli in the whole security, for the whole security situation. But what about a different scenario? Because current Russia's leadership is pretty unpredictable, to say so. And what about the alternative scenario? What about the risk of continuing of a military escalation in the Baltic Sea region? Another question, my apologies if I have missed something in the discussion. What about the Turkey's obstacles to Finland's and Sweden's NATO membership? It is also somewhat unpredictable in its well, it has its own line that it pursues, but it wants to continue pressing Finland and Sweden for both countries to surrender those representatives of Kurdish organizations that it considers to be terrorists. And the third question probably would be also there has been an almost unanimous agreement in Finland as regards Finnish NATO membership. I just wonder why alternative voices have been suppressed, why a country wants to change its political line, because probably people here don't realize enough that Ukraine is a totally different story for Russia than Finland. Those are the questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we have 3 questions and then more coming, but perhaps you can freely answer the question. So if Kristian wants to start, and then Iro, and then Eva. Thank you.
Thank you for these excellent questions. The first one to, I think it was Monica, concerns and trade-off versus national security and democracy and decision-making processes. I think that first of all, we're talking about solid democratic countries where we have a very solid democratic tradition in all our countries. So it's not where I have my main concern that each nation will find good solutions. Of course, in all sorts of matters where you have to take political decisions, there is a trade-off between how far you want to go in pre-delegating authority and how far you want to do consultation and so forth. And that is very much a national task to be able to find that delicate balance that is appropriate for your country. I think the main thing for Sweden and Finland to know is that it has to be done quickly, and then you have to find the right instruments to do it. And I can say that when we went through the exercise, so to speak, this was real life in Denmark back in 2001. We had to make a decision within 2 hours whether we wanted to support an Article 5 guarantee declaration in the NATO Council, and we managed to get the Danish Foreign Policy Committee to. It was probably about 3 hours altogether that we had. We managed to get the ministers briefed and do the interagency coordination and to make the consultation in the Foreign Policy Committee, because we had a setup where we could do this, and everybody understands once you've told them what is at stake that is important. To the gentleman in the white shirt, where was behind there? Yeah, Nordic national coalition in NATO when it comes to procurement and defense industrial cooperation. I think that there is a potential for further cooperation. Of course, our defense industries look very, very differently, but we have some overlapping interests. For example, when it comes to small and medium-sized enterprises, and making sure that they are not being overlooked in the process. So there are certainly some possibilities, some further possibilities there. And to the lady from University of Helsinki, I'll just address your first question, whether we're not also looking at the destabilizing scenario in the region. I think it's very important to be open about that there is a risk that, and probably I think that the Russians will react in different ways when Finland and Sweden joins NATO, and before that they are doing it already. They've been doing it for quite some years. I remember some years ago when they threatened Denmark by using nuclear weapons against some of our naval ships if we deployed missile defense radars on those ships. So we have seen over the years an increase in the Russian rhetoric, but not only in the rhetoric against Denmark and Sweden and Poland and the Baltic states. We have seen a sharper Russian rhetoric. We have seen far more sharp exercises, the flight with strategic bombers in the Baltic Sea region and so forth. We've seen Russian reactions, and I think that we'll also be seeing more reactions. They have limited capabilities when we speak, as we speak here, because they're using many of those capabilities they formerly had in the region. They're using them in Ukraine at the moment. So I think that we have to be open and say, well, there are probably going to be some Russian reactions when it comes to political rhetoric, when it comes to, I saw Putin's statements, when it comes to exercises and military activities in the region, when it comes to building of certain army structures or missile defense systems, stuff like that in the region. That is probably going to take place because the Russian regime also has a domestic point when they do their rhetorics. I can see by the face I probably didn't answer your question correctly, but please come back if I didn't address it. The one about alternatives being suppressed and so forth, I don't think it's for me to answer.
Iro.
Okay, thank you. We'll go in the same order. So first about the national security processes. I think it's a very complex question from which angle you start to kind of consider that, whether it's joining the alliance, was it democratic enough, the process, how we decided to, submit the application. I think it was. But also, once we joined the alliance, and like Director Fischer here just pointed out how we will take those decisions, whether join Article 5 or non-Article 5 operations, well, we have national legislation in place, and I think all countries have their different ways of doing it, and I think we just kind of have to trust that each country does it the best they can, and Finland has the structures to do it, and I think it has been practiced a lot as well, so when the time comes, the necessary decisions can be taken very quickly, as we saw this spring, within the duration of days. Then Atte Harjanne's question about the common procurement and material, I think this is the very difficult and touchy part actually about Nordic defence cooperation, because there are always national interests there in terms of national industries, and whether you are making a big procurement decision such as purchasing the F-35s or whether it's a smaller one. But what I think, we will hopefully see in the future is that when there will be kind of integrated common defense planning within NATO, that some of the Nordic countries are willing to kind of pool and share to increase operational effectiveness. It's not really to make any cost savings, but it's a fact that the resources are limited and our defense forces have different kind of niche capabilities and assets. So I do hope that there is more to be done in that sense. Then coming to Olga Kansakoski's questions about NATO and Russia and Finland, and whether NATO membership is a stabilizing factor. Obviously, it depends on the angle that you're looking from, and this is certainly not something that Russia wanted to see, but Finland has to think about its own security and how they perceive the situation. And obviously, we can't put a quotation mark, equation mark between Finland and Ukraine. They are two countries, two separate countries and different geographical regions as well. But like Director Fischer said, when we saw the rhetoric turning into action, I think this is something that we had to react on. And also, I think our President Sauli Niinistö has put it very well, that when we are maximizing our security, it's not to threaten anyone. That Finland, this is not a zero-sum game, but this is to increase our national security, and this is not to threaten Russia. So for the Turkey question, I think it's difficult to really say what exact interest Turkey has had over the course of the events. But I think Turkey has been talking also to other its allies as well. About the threat of terrorism and how important it is that this is not forgotten, because obviously for Turkey this is a threat that is more prominent considering its geographical location. So I think this is something that we have to consider. Yes, And the last point about the alternative voices suppressed, well, I must disagree with that. I think the fact that I was surprised, I have to say, this spring. I could never, ever have thought that many of those NATO opponents would have all of a sudden voted for NATO membership. It was 180 degrees turnstile in many sense. And many of the kind of even very vocal NATO skeptics turned into NATO supporters, but I still think there has been room for open discussion, and this is open democracy, and I think we also seen different voices published in our national media as well. There's been different columns, and I think it was very important that we had that discussion in our national parliament, and everyone had their opportunity to give their speech and say what they say about it. So I think there was a very short-lived, but there was a democratic opportunity for everyone to participate in the debate.
Eva.
Yes, thank you for good questions. When it comes down to rapid decision-making, I mean, there are procedures for that also in Sweden that has been practiced during international operations, for example. And when it comes to those agreements that were made with between Sweden and Finland, it was more transferring the decision-making from parliament to government when it comes to supporting Finland when there was a threat to territorial integrity. But if it would concern responding to an armed attack, that would still have to be a parliament decision. So there is a way to design rapid decision-making process but still keep parliamentary control. And I think that will be able to find those decision-making processes also in a NATO context. But as Kristian said, it's very important to prepare for that in advance, so you know how to do it. When it comes to opportunities for material cooperation, and as I mentioned before, there have been good examples and not so good examples within the Nordic cooperation, but I think it has to be based on national operational or defense planning to see where you have common interests to develop that. And I think Sweden and Finland are now doing quite a lot of joint procurement within the army. But you also have to realize that within a NATO context you have other allies, and mainly the major allies, to keep your good relationships with. So there are several concerns when you do joint procurement, I think. And just to mention a little bit concerning Turkey, and I think Sweden and Finland there has to realize that all allies have different security concerns and we have to take them seriously. But of course also be able to engage to promote human rights and democracy, and that is a balance that you have to find. But also when it comes to Turkey's opposition, there are many reasons for that, also internal political reasons, and hopefully those can be solved through this agreement that was made and negotiation format that is being put in place. But there are also other allies that have relationships with Turkey that can influence their ratification of Swedish and Finnish NATO membership. I think I'll stop there.
Yes, I think it's time to take the second batch of the questions. I have at least 4 requests on my list, 5 now. But may I ask first Minister Saarlainen to present his question, and then Ambassador Vilén, and then Admiral Kaskala.
Yes, thank you very much indeed. I have actually 2 questions. The first is that what changes do you see in the Nordic's role in Baltic defense after we have become all members? That is my first question. The other question is that about JEF. What will the changes be in JEF cooperation, Britain and the Nordics, particularly in High North? Thank you.
Thank you. Jari Vilén from the Minister of Foreign Affairs and I'm Ambassador for the Barents and Northern Dimension, or I would call them Suspended Matters Ambassador at the moment. But I think I would like to touch upon a bit about which, Iro, you said there concerning especially the role for the High North, naturally. You mentioned particularly Finland's role in the defense of the Baltic and even on Icelandic airspace, but especially this High North is something I would like to ask all of you to elaborate a bit. If you look in the newspapers and you see the recent political development, which country has been the most enthusiastic about the Finnish and Swedish membership in the NATO? It has been the Norway. Norway's Prime Minister's actions, Norway's initiatives, and Norway's, I would say, overreaching emphasis towards the Finland and our participation and the contribution that we can give for the Norway's security, including also the structures in the NATO. So I would be interested to hear your views, particularly that how do you see the role in the High North and this Norwegian initiative, which some of them are public, some of them are seen and heard in the newspapers, that what kind of NATO membership you can foresee, especially coming and building together with Norway, what we have, with all the respect to the Denmark and Denmark participation in there, but I think there has been very much the Norway-led initiatives in so far. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for all panelists for the thought-provoking thoughts and fine answers. My first question is very much related to what Jari Vilén talked about, High North. This relates also to the command structure, which all you raised. And you all know that the US vital interests are in the High North, on the other hand on the sea lines of communications on the North Atlantic, and then thirdly the Baltic Sea countries. It used to be in the Cold War period that we had Command of North, which was hosted by Norway in Kolsås. On the other hand, today we have the Northeastern Command. Do you see possibilities, this is a highly political question rather than military, that there would be a division of command on this area, Baltics, Nordics area, or would it be feasible that we have sort of a command structure where we have all the Nordic countries in the same command, and where the US interests are so relevant? On the other hand, the UK traditionally has paid lots of attention to Norway as well as the Baltic Sea. I remember that it was in the 90s, Ron Asmus, as a RAND researcher and then Assistant Secretary of Defense, suggested already that Denmark should host a command for the North. Then the partners, Finland and Sweden, would be joining and taking more responsibility of the Baltic Sea countries. There was a UK general, four-star general, leading the UF North in those days. Would be very pleased to see that to take place again. Then the other hand, my other question is about the force structure. When we were not in, well, this was already in the 90s when we deployed our forces, the Nordic forces, together in the Western Balkans. We had a Nordic brigade which took its command from the Standing High Readiness Brigade in Denmark. Other Nordics joining. Then we had Poland attached to that. But could it be politically feasible that we would compose these assets to collective defense outside our own country on the Nordic structure, based on these good experiences which we have had? The third one is just a comment what Atte Harjanne raised about the defense industry and defense material and pooling and sharing with Iro Särkkä. So when, remember when Tuva Stoltenberg, Jens Stoltenberg's father, had his initiative of 10 theses on the Nordic cooperation, which nobody believed that would be materialized in any given time. There were very good points, but some were not that good. We had a good speech. I was together with Ture Stoltenberg in Oslo Militära Samfundet, and I suggested that why don't we go further and have a virtual storage of key equipment and spare parts, ammunition, missiles, etc. It's not worthwhile building heavy maintenance capabilities in each of the countries, but we could rely on, trust on others, and give our AMRAAM missiles, say, to Denmark or Norway to be maintained, and vice versa. We have so much material which are common to everyone, every Nordic nation. But then it was not feasible. But could we trust in NATO alliance that this sort of a structure could be established in support by NATO material agencies? Thank you.
If the panelists don't mind, I'm tempted to take the two remaining questions, and then first, my new colleague, Rachel Tausenfreund from FIIA.
Thanks. Yes, as Matti said, I'm Rachel Tausenfreund, and I am a visiting researcher with FIIA. And I have just one question. The Finnish and Swedish membership is obviously enhancing NATO, but it's also enhancing, especially with the Danish change of policy, the EU pillar within NATO. And there's been a lot of talk about, in this session, about Nordic cooperation. And I just wonder if you think the Nordics either will or should focus first on Nordic cooperation within NATO, or if they will try to push for EU cooperation, enhanced pooling, sharing, and all of the words that have been talked about, enhanced EU cooperation within NATO. That's my question.
And then the last question from Hanna Ajonen, Tampere University.
Thank you, and thank you very much to all the speakers. I would have a future-oriented question, or then again, not, perhaps. We have been speaking a lot about NATO's role in territorial defense, but it also still has a role in crisis management out of area. Do you see that the Nordic countries would have a common way of seeing that role in the future? And is that also possibly a field where they could make a joint contribution? Thanks.
Yes, thank you for the questions. And at this point, I'd like to ask the panelists to respond. Iro, you may want to start, and then perhaps Eva, and then Kristian. And
okay.
I'll give you 3 to 5 minutes.
Wow, so many questions. I think I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to answer all of them. They are very specific and very good questions. But I will try and answer as many as I can. First of all, Pertti Salolainen's question about the Baltic cooperation and Baltic defense, and what will it be when Finland and Sweden will join. Well, first of all, I think it's easy to draw this conclusion. I think there will be more Nordic presence because Finland and Sweden will join the Baltic countries. I think it's going to be the air policing to start with, but there's been some talk in the public as well whether, or analysis whether Finland and Sweden will actually join the enhanced forward presence troops, and whether it's actually, functional, because we already have these framework nations there that are operating them, and what would they bring in? Well, they could, I think, still bring in something, whether it's going to be troops on the ground or whether it's going to be some material capabilities. I think politically it's just so important for Finland, especially to support the Baltic countries, that I would be very surprised if we don't see Finnish presence there. But I can't give you any more concrete, examples. For the JEF, in High North, obviously, I think Ambassador Villen maybe touched upon this question as well, or maybe was it Pertti Salolainen? Sorry for my notes. I think there's going to be definitely more exercises, and we already see more exercises, and it's basically about training the troops, and I think it goes hand in hand how and why the Nordic countries will be more present there. I mean, I think our troops, first of all, they are functional to work and to operate in very demanding cold conditions, and I think this is something that the Nordic countries could, and especially Finland, could bring in, because we share a similar operating environment. But I have to say that I'm not quite sure if, in terms of foreign policy and when it comes to security policy, Finland has really, truly yet comprehended what the High North is. That for us, the High North is where Lapland is and Rovaniemi is, and that's where the line goes. Whereas the Norwegians, like you said, they've been pushing a lot for Finland's, NATO membership this spring, and I think they are very interested to see how Finland will contribute to that. And I think a practical thing that how Finland could be present in the High North is through air power, because those planes can be flown very quickly, long distances, and there was a very interesting article actually in Helsingin Sanomat this summer analyzing how the increased air power between Finland, Sweden, Norway will contribute, and Denmark as well, to the air power in Nordic countries at large. So I think this is something tangible that could happen. Then Admiral Juhani Kaskialan's questions about the command structure. I was wondering as well whether bringing in the Baltic countries and Poland would make it too large. Maybe we should focus really in the Nordic region, and maybe going back to Ambassador Villen's question, it could be Norway where that is happening. So I think we are likely to see a new command, this is my guess, and there will be a collective structure, and time will show where it actually will be, but I think somewhere in Norway. And also, when it comes to the trust part, yes, it's about trusting one another, about pooling and sharing, and I think this is what ideally Nordefco wanted to gain as one of the two main principles: cost saving and operational effectiveness. And it's very touchy when you talk about the national defense industries and how they will, how we'll be able to pull that. But I think over the time when we get over this big political decision, I think there is room for that as well. Then there was a question about EU cooperation. Sorry, I didn't catch your name, or I forgot it. Yes, sorry.
Rachel.
Rachel, yes, thank you. And I don't know. I mean, I was a strong believer in EU's defense policy for many, many years. And I really wanted to believe that it will prosper into something really tangible, and that we could actually have a common EU defense. But EU is so big, and it doesn't have really the necessary command structure. It doesn't have the necessary military capabilities, and it would be duplicating NATO. So I think it kind of came clear to me sometime in the early 2000s, actually already, that it's going to be either NATO or it's going to be some other arrangement, but it's not going to be EU. And I think that, therefore, I believe that Finland and Sweden and the Nordic countries have more potential. And, well, Norway is part of EU, not part of EU anyway. So, to pool their resources and to kind of develop the idea of Nordic defense within NATO. And I think we, as a smaller, we are more agile as well. And I think we will see these smaller regional formats of cooperation. And that actually takes to the last question, Professor Hanna Ojanen's question about the common operations and the common culture and ways of, cooperating on the ground as well. So, yes, I believe, like you said, that it's likely that in the future we could have operations in which we have like a Nordic group working together, and it's not only about that what assets we have, but I think it's about the common culture as well, and the way we've been trained and in which conditions we've been trained, and I think it will materialize very well, even though it's in a global theater in some expeditionary operation somewhere out there. Thank you.
Yes, Eva and then Kristian.
Okay. Sorry. Maybe I start from a little bit from the end, but EU cooperation, enhancing EU cooperation with NATO. I think you will see that there are sort of different layers of cooperation, that we have the Nordic cooperation, and then you have the JEF cooperation, and then you have the EU and NATO, and the different formats might be good for different reasons. I agree with Iro's reflections on the EU, but the EU can actually be handle certain types of threats that we know, hybrid and cyber threats and so on, and that could enhance cooperation with NATO, and EU can also be complementary when it comes to capacity building, for example. So there are examples where, and I actually think that Swedish and Finnish NATO membership and Denmark's participation in the EU defense policy will enhance EU-NATO cooperation, and hopefully complementary and not competing with each other. When it comes to command structure, I think that is an sort of topical issue in NATO, but as I understand from now, Norway is under Joint Forces Command in Norfolk, whereas the Baltic States is under Joint Forces Command Brunssum, and when Sweden and Finland joins, a decision has to be made where should they be placed, should there be different, under different commands in the Nordic countries or the same. I think that is what the issue is about. Of course, to be able to promote this operational cooperation that has already been developed, it would be better to be under the same command. And I actually heard someone say that there's proposals of this Norwegian major exercise, Cold Response, becoming a common exercise between Norway, Sweden and Finland, which would be good. Because as I talked about this trilateral cooperation focusing on the Northern Cap, that is a clear joint interest to defend that area together, depending on that. The countries have, Sweden, for example, has very sparse military resources there, so would benefit from operational coordination in that area. And I think, yes, contributions to NATO's enhanced forward presence in the Baltic states. I think there will be demands for that, and also an interest from Sweden and Finland to contribute. And they will actually, they will grow in size, so there will be opportunities to contribute. Denmark now, for example, has a battalion in Latvia, so they are increasing in size, and that will be part of NATO reworking the strategic and operational plans for the defense of the area. I will stop there.
Kristian.
Thank you, and thank you again for some excellent questions. I'll address a few of them. Minister, you asked about the potential for Nordic cooperation towards the Baltic states. I think that there's a tremendous amount of possibilities. I'm sure that Finnish and Swedish participation in Baltic air policing would be extremely welcome. Of course, we'll also see dedicated forces for the brigade headquarters in the Baltic states. There is, of course, the obvious one with Sweden and Finland joining NATO, the staging of equipment in pre-stationing of equipment in Finland and Sweden. There is the whole area of potential support for if there's a operation in the Baltic operations, to have support, medical, logistics, and so forth from from Finland and Sweden, Denmark and Norway, of course, also, and not least also the political visibility shown by the Nordic states towards the Baltic countries. I think it's very important to show that there is a strong political interest. This means having frequent visits, also at the highest levels, from ministers, but also from parliaments in that regard. When it comes to you, my good old colleague, it's great to see you again. Command structure issues. I think the very best would be if the Nordics would be able to come forward with a solution, a common solution to the NATO system, so to speak, on how such a Baltic Sea region command comes up. It is absolutely clear, as you said, Iro, that it is not easy because we have this issue of Norway needing to have a closer link to the Arctic than perhaps Sweden and Finland. These things can be dealt with, but we should have a common position. The Nordics and also the Balts coming together there. I'm pretty sure that MNC Northeast in Poland will stay. It's going to be a big fight to let the Poles let go of that one. They fought so hard to get it. And the divisional command headquarters in Latvia, led by Denmark, I think that would also need to be there. But we need to have a joint command in the Baltics, meaning a command where you have all services represented, because there needs to be quick decisions taken if need be. And then on the Arctic, Ambassador, I think it's very interesting to look at the NATO strategic concept, which for the first time mentions the High North. That is really an upgrading of the High North in NATO, and something which will be flowing down into the defense planning processes, force goals and so forth. At the same time, it's clear, as you also alluded to, there are different opinions on how much importance there should be devoted by NATO to the Arctic, where Canada traditionally has been the one saying, NATO, keep your hands off, and Norway being the one pushing for more NATO attention to the Arctic. I think that we are seeing a situation where we're getting more similar points on that. I forgot to say US engagement in that headquarter is going to be absolutely essential if we're going to have such a Baltic Sea region headquarter. What was the last one I was going to? No, that was it. Unless we have more time.
I'm afraid we don't, and thank you, Kristian, and want to warmly thank the panelists for participating, and also warm thanks to our audience here in the Parliament and also online. This was the first NATO-related FIIA seminar this fall, and there's more seminars coming. And FIIA will remain vigilant when it comes to following Finland's and Sweden's NATO processes, and make sure to follow our publications as well. But once again, thank you, and have a wonderful rest of August, everyone. Thank you.